Vain Britons boast no longer with proud indignity. By land your conquering legions, your matchless strength I see. Since we your sons incensed, our swords have girded on. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for war and Washington.
Today, I'd like to take you on a walking tour of Portsmouth during the time that Jonathan Mitchel Sewall lived here. We'll stop at some of the places that are still here and remember some of the people and places that Jonathan would have known that are no longer here. We'll use this 1813 map because it is the first one to show this much detail. So let's take a walk, starting in Market Street, Pave Street, as it was known back then, due to the fact that it was the only street in Portsmouth that was paved. Around 1770, Jonathan moved here to continue his law studies with John Pickering, whose home and law office was in Market Street, where the Kennedy Gallery is today. The printing office of the New Hampshire Gazette and the home of the Fowle family was across the street from the Pickerings on the corner of Market Street and Market Square. Daniel Fowle's enslaved pressman was Primus. It would have been Primus who printed out all those ads for runaway slaves like the one seen here. I'm sure that he and Jonathan became friends here in Pave Street because when Primus died in 1791, Jonathan wrote an epitaph for him that was printed in the newspaper and presumably read at the graveside because of the way it begins.
I met Primus when we both lived on Pave Street. We liked to talk and have a drink together. You see, his back hurt, and I was always suffering from the strong drugs I'd been given when I had yellow fever. A few drinks helped us both.
Under these clods old Primus lies, at rest and free from noise, no longer seen by mortal eyes or grieved by roguish boys. The cheerful dram he loved, 'tis true, which hastened on his end. But some in Pave Street well knew he was a hearty friend, and did possess a grateful mind, though oft borne down with pain, yet where he found a neighbor kind, he surely went again. Too often did the mirth of some his innocence betray, by giving larger draughts of rum than he could swill away. But now he's dead, we sure may say of him, as of all men, that while in silent graves they lay, they'll not be plagued again.
We know that Jonathan was also known for imbibing the cheerful dram, as he felt it helped him when he was overcome with those severe nervous afflictions mentioned earlier. When this problem was pointed out to Sarah March, who became his second wife, she said, "I would rather marry Mr. Sewall drunk than any other man sober."
Vain Britons boast no longer with proud indignity. By land your conquering legions, your matchless strength I see. Since we your sons incensed, our swords have girded on. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for war and Washington.
In 1775, Jonathan wrote the words for this song soon after George Washington arrived in Boston to take charge of the colonist troops in June that year. He called the song War in Washington. This is a broadside that was printed in Salem and is preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society. According to various sources, this song was sung in all the colonial army camps, when soldiers were marching, and even in taverns and in homes. One example of its popularity is in the diary of Dr. Albigence Waldo, who was commissioned as surgeon of the 1st Connecticut Infantry Regiment. His regiment joined the main Continental Army in the fall of 1777. In an excerpt written during the winter at Valley Forge, the entry for December 14th is, "See the poor soldier, when in health, with what cheerfulness he meets his foes and encounters every hardship barefoot. he labors through the mud and cold with a song in his mouth, extolling war and Washington. On the 31st of October, 1789, George Washington, the new President of the United States, rode into Portsmouth with his entourage. He came out on the balcony of the State House, and Jonathan was standing just opposite on a stage that had been erected in front of Peter Pierce's shop, which is where the Tuscan Market is today. Jonathan had written 3 odes, which were sung to the president by him and his friends Sparhawk and Dame. They were accompanied by the town chorus and band. It must have been an extremely exciting time for all of Portsmouth, and especially for Jonathan. Just before we leave Market Square, in Brewster's Rambles we read The Literary Mirror of various dates in 1808, published by Stephen Sewall, opposite the Brick Market. That's behind the North Church where Stonewall Kitchen is today. Neat and tasteful in its typographical execution, and containing a judicious variety of original and selected matter. It was published, I think, but a single year, though deserving a longer lease of life. Stephen was Jonathan's eldest son, who became a printer, and he published this newspaper for only the year of his father's death. It contains a poignant elegy on the death of J.M. Sewall, Esquire, entirely in verse. But now let's continue on our tour and head down Daniel Street. The last building on the south side at the corner of Penhallow is what became known as Noah's Ark. I believe the architect for the new building thought it should look like an ark, but Noah Parker and his family lived here during the Revolutionary War years. He was a blacksmith, a silversmith, and a merchant. He sold all manner of things, as you can see in this advertisement from the New Hampshire Gazette. But he was soon to become a minister as well, so Noah's Ark was biblical rather than structural. John Murray, a Universalist minister, came to Portsmouth in November 1773 for the first time. Before he left town, he had gathered a large number of followers, which included many prominent men that became the nucleus of the church here. In 1777, Noah Parker became the minister, and after his death in 1787, Jonathan was asked to be the minister. He declined, but continued as a member of the church, and in 1793, he presented the petition to the state for its incorporation. Looking further down Daniel Street on the opposite side, just beyond the McIntyre building, was Studley's Tavern. The whole building was moved to Hancock Street in 1966 and is now the administration offices for the Strawberry Bank Museum. The tavern had been the main congregating place for American patriots before and during the Revolutionary War. So we can imagine that Jonathan and his friends could be found here frequently. Next, let's walk along what is now Penhallow Street towards Bow Street. There was a big garden behind John Penhallow's house. He was a merchant who lived in Market Street, next door to the Pickerings, and had a shop in Congress Street. According to Brewster's Rambles, the garden included all the land that became Penhallow Street from Daniel Street down to Bow Street. In 1802, Jonathan's son John opened a store in Market Street where he sold English goods suitable for the season, like those shown here. By December of that year, his shop was at 2 Bow Street. It was one of those that was burned in the fire on the 26th of December that year. But by December 1805, he was back at the same address, the site of Native Son clothing store now. He advertised himself there as an auctioneer and continued to sell English and India goods. One of the results of this first fire was the incorporation of the New Hampshire Fire and Marine Insurance Company in 1803. John became its secretary and continued to be so for about 10 years. Various books that discuss the history of theater in Portsmouth state that there were no theatrical productions performed during the war until 1787, and then after the building of the Bow Street Theatre in 1791. But it turns out that some of the gentlemen of Portsmouth, as they are described in the newspapers, were putting on quite serious plays much earlier, probably at Staver's Tavern or the Assembly Rooms. Addison's Cato and Shakespeare's Coriolanus, according to the newspapers, were staged in Portsmouth in 1778. That was the year that General George Washington defied a congressional ban on theatrical productions. After the dreadful winter at Valley Forge, a production of the tragedy Cato was performed for the entire company on the 11th of May. But 2 months earlier, in March, the play had been performed in Portsmouth, and Jonathan had written a new epilogue to the play. In it, he equated Caesar to King George, Cato to Washington, and Juba to Lafayette. Doesn't it seem likely that the players at Valley Forge would have used Jonathan's epilogue? I found it printed in newspapers in Portsmouth then, and in Boston and Hartford, Connecticut in April that year, so well before that performance at Valley Forge. There was one couplet from Jonathan's epilogue that became very famous. He had written, "No pent-up Utica contracts your powers, but the whole boundless continent is yours." The play takes place in the city of Utica, where Cato and a small Roman Senate stand ready to defend the last vestige of the Roman Republic against Caesar. This notice from April 1876 is asking for articles to take to the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. General Frank W. Miller was the Centennial historian for New Hampshire. He was collecting things from colonial times to take to the exhibition. Miller was going to send Daniel Fowle's old wooden and stone printing press that he owned, and then we read, General Miller has also the old armchair in which Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, the Portsmouth poet of the Revolution, wrote the famous couplet, "No pent-up Utica contracts your powers, but the whole boundless continent is yours." I asked myself, where's that chair today? Jonathan's entire epilogue to Cato was reprinted in a wide variety of newspapers during the 1870s and 80s to celebrate 100 years since the time when it was written. The newspapers actually came from the whole boundless continent. I found the words in the Louisiana Democrat, the Wisconsin Republican, Jamestown, New York Journal, the True Flag of Boston, and the Sacramento Daily Union, among many others, as well as being reprinted in several New Hampshire newspapers, of course. At the end of 1791, the Bow Street Theatre opened in a converted warehouse along the river. The building had a pit and a gallery, and it was said that it could seat 400. Jonathan provided various poems for the plays that were staged there. Shown here is about half of the introductory prologue, which is entitled "On Opening the Theatre in This Town." But my favorite is the one for a prologue that he wrote for the evening's entertainment on July 31st, 1792. It was proclaimed by the director, Mr. Watts, and I think it does a wonderful job of describing the warehouse that was now a theater and the work of the managers there.
Methinks I see him with his magic wand, like some old necromancer circled stand. He strikes the warehouse and the fabric low, turns to a theater beneath the blow. Where hogsheads, bales were once promiscuous seen, here frowns a monarch, and there walks a queen. That wood, that mountain, and that beauteous valley was where the worthy owner once kept tally, where portermen with muddy hoofs once flocked, great Chrononhotonthologos has stalked.
He was the main character in a tragedy.
And where yon beauteous forms attract your love, dry goods, tier over tier, were piled above. Then, oh, this conjurer, favor with your nod. If you refute that selfsame potent rod that from a warehouse reared this magic scene, shall turn all to a paltry store again.
Just around the corner is St. John's Church, But the original wooden church that burned in the 1806 fire was called the Queen's Chapel, and it was renamed in 1791, as royal names had obviously fallen out of favor. On Saturday, December 14, 1799, it was reported that George Washington had died peacefully. According to an article in the Oracle of the Day newspaper the following week, at an early hour on Tuesday morning, all public offices, stores, and shops were shut. Active life stood still. Business and pleasure paused. The flags of all the ships in the harbor were at half-mast. Mourning crapes were worn by almost every individual. At 11 a.m., a procession formed at the Assembly Room on Vaughan Street, that's now Portwalk Place, and proceeded up to Congress Street. First were Captain Long's artillerymen, then Captain Sparhawk's light infantry, followed by Captain Larkin's Governor Gilman's Blues with their drums muffled and music in crape. They were followed by the Masons of the Grand Lodge of St. John. Then came, and I quote, the orator, Jonathan M. Sewall, Esquire, the pride of eloquence and power of verse. He was followed by the Reverend Mr. Willard, rector of St. John's, then more military and civic officers, the other clergy from Portsmouth and vicinity, and everyone else who had come to walk with them. As they turned into Congress Street, the procession passed through two lines of children belonging to the three public schools. The streets from there to the church were lined 6 deep with mourners. After the Reverend Willard read the prayers and a hymn was sung, Jonathan came forward to proclaim the eulogy. He had composed it at the request of the inhabitants. The long article published in the newspaper about the celebration says this about the eulogy. The interesting, impressive form of the orator, his fine powers of melancholic modulation, the heaving bosom and the bursting sigh would have commanded the best applauses if neither sentiment, genius, nor taste had been discernible in the eulogy, but it happily combined the depth of thought, elegance of expression, and the beauties of gentle, sorrowful oratory. A Washington might have heard it without a blush, and an Adams will praise it. But now let's continue down Bow Street to the Warner House. Jonathan Warner lived here with his wife, Mary McPheedrus. It was her father who had the house built in about 1716. Warner's sympathies were with the British, and he had a few enslaved people working for him. 2 of them, Cato and Peter, were among 20 African men who signed a petition to the legislature in 1779 to abolish slavery. One thing that was needed that the petitioners themselves could not do was someone to present it in court. No record can be found about who presented the petition. However, Professor Robert Dishman, in an article published in Historical New Hampshire in 1970, makes the case that because a lawyer was needed to present the petition, and he also needed to be someone who would plead the case with passion and conviction, and preferably one who'd give his services for free. Professor Dishman believed that person was Jonathan Mitchel Sewall. So if this is true, it is likely that Jonathan may have been friends with Cato and Peter rather than with Jonathan and Mary Warner.
You can see the lightning rod that they say Benjamin Franklin added to the house. Years before I came to Portsmouth. But I wrote a poem with a verse about him that you might like. Franklin's hobby was lightning rods, thunder, and fire. How he joyed to bestride the electrical wire. When oppression's bolt strove, freedom's fain to disjoint. He repelled the explosion and struck to the point. That was his hobby.
Now, if we cross over Daniel Street and walk down Chapel and turn right on State Street, when we get back to Penhallow, across from Temple Israel, this is where Abraham and Rachel Isaac had their store at the sign of the Golden Teapot. They sold a wide variety of goods, and he was an auctioneer. They were the only Jewish couple in Portsmouth at that time. When Abraham died in February 1803, He was buried in North Cemetery, and Jonathan wrote his epitaph.
Entombed beneath where earthborn troubles cease, a son of faithful Abraham sleeps in peace. In life's first bloom he left his native air, a sojourner as all his fathers were. Through various toils his active spirit ran, a faithful steward and an honest man. His soul, we trust, now freed from mortal woes, finds in the patriarch's bosom sweet repose.
After Abraham's death, Jonathan's son John used the store and became an auctioneer. In 1805, he was able to move back to Bow Street again. A little farther along State Street is the site of the Portsmouth Latin Grammar School. For nearly 40 years, Samuel Hale was the master, and he and his family lived just on the other side of Pleasant Street, where the Book and Bar was until recently. In Brewster's Rambles about Portsmouth, published in 1859, we read, "Although the teacher and nearly all of his host of scholars have now passed away, yet to his instructions, his example, and devoted life may be attributed as much that has tended to build up Portsmouth and give it character as to any other source, with due deference to the pulpit. His fame in the regions of the Piscataqua was equal to that of his contemporary, Master Lovell, in the metropolis of New England. Master John Lovell had been Jonathan's teacher at the Boston Public Latin School. Samuel and his wife Mary's son John died tragically at the age of 33 in 1796. He had also studied law with John Pickering, and he was also buried in the North Cemetery. His long epitaph was written by Jonathan and ends,
"Those pungent sorrows parents, kindred feel, their signs, their tears, alas, but feebly tell. Long shall his country, oft by faction torn, their faithful patriot promised father mourn, nor to their splendid roll of worthies fail, to add with undissembled boast a hail."
Now let's walk down Washington Street, presumably named for the man himself. At the next corner, where the Temple Israel parking lot is today, was the house of Dr. Hall Jackson. During the Revolutionary War, he was the chief surgeon for the New Hampshire troops enlisted in the Continental Army and served as an artillery captain. In 1782, Portsmouth granted Dr. Jackson and a few other physicians permission to create a hospital on Hensel's Island for the quarantine of smallpox patients. Tragically, he died at the age of 58, and he too was buried in North Cemetery with an epitaph by Jonathan.
To heal disease, to calm the widow's sigh, and wipe the tear from poverty's swollen eye was thine. But that skill on others shone, though life to them could not preserve thy own. Yet still thou livest in many a grateful breast, and deeds like thine enthrone thee with the blessed.
I think we've had too many epitaphs by now, so let's continue along Washington Street. Watch your step on the west side of the street because it still has the old paving stones from the corner of Court Street down to where the canoe bridge used to be. The river at high tide flowed across the road and through to Pleasant Street. Remember Jonathan's earlier illness and that his efforts to relieve his problems gave him the reputation as someone who drank too much. His biographical note in the Bench and Bar of New Hampshire says, "But his friends loved him nonetheless and appear never to have lost respect for him." Can you imagine Jonathan and his friends making their way along here when they had had too much to drink? Now let's cut through the woods to John and Elizabeth Langdon's home. John's schooling was with Samuel Hale at the Portsmouth Latin Grammar School. The Langdons hosted a dinner party for President Washington when he was here in 1789. Early during Langdon's second term as president of New Hampshire, he appointed Jonathan as the Attorney General for the state, but Jonathan did not take up the post for health and family reasons. In 1797, Thomas Elwyn, an Englishman, married John Langdon's daughter Elizabeth. In 1805, Langdon was running for governor of New Hampshire again, this time as a Democratic Republican, which was the party of Thomas Jefferson. Elwyn wrote a 31-page pamphlet entitled A Letter to a Federalist in reply to some of the popular objections to the motives and tendency of the measures of the present administration. He was trying to convince Federalists that Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party stood for everything that they wanted as well. The New Hampshire Gazette on February 25th supported his views and wrote, "The moderation of the sentiments and the spirit of good manners which runs through the whole of this persuasive letter is highly creditable to the writer." An article in the Farmers' Weekly Museum of Walpole, New Hampshire, a month later, after saying about the letter that it was beneath the attention of a critic, described the author this way: "The writer must be either an egregious numbskull himself, or have a most contemptible opinion of his readers." Well, John Langdon won the election for the governor on the 12th of March, but on the 30th, the Portsmouth Oracle and also the Boston Columbian Sentinel advertised a pamphlet, which was entitled A Parody on some of the most striking passages in a late pamphlet entitled A Letter to a Federalist, with large additions and improvements, by Vernon H. Quincy, published by the Oracle Press in Portsmouth. The 31-page letter written by Thomas Elwyn had been turned into a 47-page poem with copious footnotes. Everyone must have known that it was really written by Jonathan Mitchel Sewall. In the Portsmouth Oracle, we read, "Every Federalist, every man of taste and sentiment should possess a copy of this interesting pamphlet." One of the quotations at the beginning is from Alexander Pope. "Ask you what provocation I have had? The strong antipathy of good to bad." Heading south on Pleasant Street, we could see where the Universalists met early on when Noah Parker was their minister. The meeting house was next to Captain Thomas Thompson's house, which has recently been greatly expanded. In Brewster's Rambles, we read, "I have heard Noah Parker preach here, and seen J.M. Sewall scattering the hymns of his own composition among the audience." Farther along, we come to what was known as the Governor's Mansion and is now Wentworth Senior Living. On the 13th of June in 1775, Colonel John Fenton, a judge whom Jonathan had worked with in Grafton County the previous year, visited the governor and Mrs. Wentworth at their home here in Pleasant Street. Fenton was a staunch loyalist, and a Portsmouth mob was enraged by his presence in town. In the words of Mrs. Wentworth, "They stove at the house with clubs, brought a large cannon and placed it before the door, and swore to fire through the house." Fenton surrendered, and the Wentworths left the house that night and never returned to Portsmouth, or soon after to New Hampshire for the rest of their lives. The home was actually owned by John Fisher, another loyalist, who was named in the Proscription Act of 1778, but not in the Confiscation Act. So he was banished from the state, but his property, including this house, was not taken. 9 years later, this advertisement appeared in the New Hampshire Gazette on 3 occasions in February and March of 1787, noting that the house was now for sale and that Jonathan M. Sewall was living in it. If we look back to November 1778, 9 years earlier, when the Proscription Act was being written, it is recorded in the Journal of the House, voted that the committee appointed in May last, together with Mr. John Smith and Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, Esquire, shall join to be a committee to draft and bring in a bill for confiscating the estates of sundry persons therein to be named, and lay the same before this house. I wondered whether Jonathan got to choose a place to live from all the properties that had been proscribed but weren't up for sale at that time. At some point in 1778, Jonathan married Sarah March of Greenland. His first wife, also Sarah, with whom he had his son Stephen, had died in February 1777. Dr. Clement March and John Pickering were great friends, so Jonathan had most likely known Sarah for some time. It was this Sarah who was warned about Jonathan's propensity for drink, and was reported as saying, "I would rather marry Mr. Sewall drunk than any other man sober." In 1780, their son John Barnard was born, and in 1785, their daughter Caroline. So they and his son Stephen must have all lived in the governor's mansion. From there, they moved around the corner to Gate Street, where their daughter Susan was born in 1790. During the time that the Sewall family lived in Gate Street, Jonathan wrote many orations, odes, and poems, and managed to have his own book, Miscellaneous Poems, published in 1801. For the 4th of July each year, the bells in the town were rung, flags were hoisted on the ships in the harbor, cannon were sounded, the shops and stores were closed, and everyone celebrated. Often the military paraded from 5 until 9 o'clock in the morning. After a drill, they marched through the streets and fired rounds at various locations. There was usually a procession to a meeting house where there was music, the reading of the Declaration of Independence, and an oration followed by the entire procession, including the people of the town marching through some of the principal streets. On July 6, 1805, we read about the celebration. 2 excellent songs from the elegant and ingenious pen of J.M. Sewall, Esquire, were sung at the gathering in the Assembly Room. One of the songs was printed in the Green Mountain Patriot in Peacham, Vermont, a song for the anniversary of independence, July 4th, 1805. It was introduced like this: "The union of genius and patriotism is rare and valuable, and deserves to be greeted with particular applause. For this reason, the following very excellent song merits a place in every paper in the Union, not only as a compliment to the author, but in justice to the nation." However, it was the other song that appeared in all the newspapers. The Hobbies Parodied was introduced in the Gazette of Maine in this way. The following humorous and satirical song was composed by J.M. Sewall, Esquire of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a gentleman whose poetic talents have often contributed largely to the amusement of his friends. The song has 14 verses, each one speaking of the hobbies of various men or groups or states, including Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Jay, Franklin, Britain, Jacobins, Federalists, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New England. Just a few examples.
Great Washington's hobby from first dawning youth was virtue and valor and wisdom and truth, while Jefferson's hobby on Chesterfield's plan was to rise in the statesman but sink in the man. That's his hobby. Sage Adams' hobby was science profound, with a just rule to measure and plummet to sound, in pursuit of true wisdom, despising fatigue, for a courtier too honest, too frank for intrigue, his wisdom our hobby. Franklin's hobby was lightning rods, thunder, and fire, how he joyed to bestride the electrical wire. When oppression's bolts strove freedom's fane to disjoint, he repelled the explosion and struck to the point. That was his hobby.
The Hobbies Parodied included most of its verses was found in the newspapers from nearly all of the states, from Portland, Maine to Charleston, South Carolina, including 5 in New York City, 3 in Boston, as well as those in many other cities and towns.
Vain Britons boast no longer with proud indignity. By land your conquering legions, your matchless strength I see. Since we your sons incensed, our swords have girded on. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for war and Washington.